By now, we are all familiar with the meaning of the word to communicate. We arrived at a working definition of communication, and we all agreed that communication is the process of sending and receiving symbols with meaning attached to them for the purpose of improving relationships. However, the process of sending and receiving symbols, which seems like a fairly uncomplicated process, that is, finding the right symbols and fitting it to the right meaning, is really a very involved and a very tricky process. Why is it so? Because communication and encoding is not a simple matter of fitting names to things, objects, feelings, ideas, experiences, and so on. But the transmission of symbols, exchange of symbols through a process which we call the filtering process. In the last session, we talked about the filters of communication, which means that when symbols are exchanged, when they are sent and received, this doesn't occur in a vacuum. They are percolated through the filters of each party in the communication process. What do we mean by being percolated? What we mean is that any symbol that we may use, irrespective of whether it's a verbal symbol or a non-verbal symbol, the meaning that it has is shaped by the filters of the individuals involved in the communication process. A very simple symbol like nice might acquire various shades of meaning depending on the user. Let's now examine the various filters that make the process of encoding messages, that is, putting messages, placing meaning in symbols, so very complicated. What are the filters of communication? The first filter that we look at is knowledge. What do we mean by knowledge? Do we mean that some have more knowledge and some have less knowledge? That's partially true, but it's only part of the story. When we are looking at knowledge as a filter of communication, we are not really looking at knowledge per se. We are not looking at knowledge in the absolute. We are not saying that some have more knowledge than others. What we are saying, we are talking about really is knowledge in common. Knowledge of a particular symbol or particular object in common is what we are referring to. For instance, in an organization, depending on the functional area one is viewing the product from, the product is not one thing. Different individuals, different functionaries in an organization have different knowledge of the same product. For instance, the production manager would have a very different knowledge of the product than, say, the sales manager or the marketing manager or the finance manager. Now, when we are talking about knowledge working as a symbol and filter in communication, what we need to know is not having more or less knowledge, but having a knowledge in common. So the different functional areas, if they converge at a agreed knowledge of the product, that would be very crucial in constructing messages. We move on to status. What do we mean by status? By status, we mean one's consciousness of being superior or inferior. One can give examples, there are examples galore of this kind of situation. A person who is in a dominant position and a person who is in a subordinate position, their communication is inhibited by their consciousness of where they stand in the hierarchy. You could take a very simple situation like father and son, the father being older and the son being younger. The son would feel inhibited from expressing certain ideas because of this consciousness of his status being that of a junior. Similarly, in the workplace, the boss's perception of himself, his own status as that of a senior person, might prevent him from explaining his meaning completely to a subordinate, which might create where status might come in the way of communication, because the boss automatically assumes that whatever he says is clear, unambiguous and correct. So this perception that I'm superior, I know everything, prevents the boss from listening to his subordinates or explaining his meaning fully to his subordinates. In the process, the meaning may not be very clear to the subordinate. This also works in the reverse direction. The subordinate's consciousness of being low in the hierarchy. If the subordinate were to feel, oh, I cannot ask my boss a question, what would my boss think? Would he think I'm stupid? Probably this feeling, or maybe his fear, he has a very intimidating boss, his fear that I cannot ask a question, might prevent him from seeking clear clarifications, and in the process the wrong message might be understood by him. So status is yet another filter in the communication process. From status, let's move on to culture. We've talked several times and we will be talking about how culture is a barrier, is a filter in encoding messages, encoding and decoding messages. We're talking about cultural differences. Normally when we talk about cultural differences between people, we are generally referring to geographical regions. We say that Indians have a different culture, say, from Americans, or Americans are different from Europeans. And we say, well, people from another part of the world, another country, might not have a culture in common with you, and therefore there is a likelihood that what you say to, the cultural symbols might be lost on the users of another community. But when we are talking about culture, we're not only talking about geographical differences, but there could be differences of other kinds. For instance, it could be one of class. Let's take an example. Let's take a very concrete example. You are expecting, and you work in an organization. You are expecting a very important visitor from overseas. Say you are expecting an American client, and you asked your secretary, what do we call her? Let's give her a name, Mona. You asked Mona to book a table for two for dinner in a nice place. This is the message you have given to your secretary, Mona. Book a table for two in a nice place for dinner. Now, you go to your usual haunt. You go to, what is your conception of nice? Remember, you are the CEO and you are entertaining a very important client. What's your overseas client, an American client? So naturally you want to showcase the best of your organization, and normally where do you take your most important clients? Maybe to Oberoi Grand or to Taj Bengal. Yes, so you go there at 6:30, you take with your client in tow, you go there and you ask to be shown to your table, and you find that you have no booking. You are livid, you're furious, because you had made your message, you thought you had made your message very clear to Mona. You had told her that I need to take my client out to dinner to a nice place. Why is it? So you find a corner, you call her on the cell phone, and you fume and fret and you scream at her and you say, what the hell? Where is my booking? I find there's no booking. You are in a very embarrassing situation, and Mona looks absolutely, sounds absolutely flabbergasted. The more you scream, the more upset she gets, and she breaks into tears. Why does this happen? Where has Mona booked you? Mona has booked you in qualities because she has booked you in qualities. For what time? For 9 o'clock, because that's when we take in India, dinner is served, dinner time is between 8:30 and 9. So she's not made any mistake. She's booked you in a nice place. Quality restaurant is not a bad place to entertain your friends. She's booked you in quality at 8:30. She's been very conscientious. She's done her duty, and here you are screaming at her. Why does this miscommunication occur? Because your perception of nice, Oberoi Grand or Taj Bengal is very different from Mona's perception of a nice place to eat. Why? Because of the difference in your uh, class. Class in the sense of economic class. Your income is maybe 10 times that of your secretary. So she cannot imagine blowing up an entire month's salary for a meal in Grand or in Taj Bengal. And in her conception, qualities is good enough. Now this can also be an interpretation of cultural difference. It's not, this is it's an example of cultural differences of two kinds, one of status, economic class, and the other of geographical differences, cultural differences between US and India, where the dinner times are very different, but they can also be gender differences. Your idea of a nice place might be very different from your female colleague's idea of a nice place. You might prefer a more robust setting where your idea of the ambience you're looking for in a restaurant is very different from, say, a female's idea of the right ambience to entertain a guest. So gender, geographical location, class, and there could be any number of cultural differences between people which act as filters in the communication process and which complicate the process of encoding and decoding of messages. How about emotional state? The next filter that we come to is the emotional state. How does emotional state play a role in your reception and sending of messages? Do you find yourself acting more reasonably, more rationally when you are in a good mood, when things have gone well with you, and or when you are in a cool state of mind and behaving rather irrationally when you're not in a good mood? That might be a sign of a unprofessional manager, I agree, but we are human beings and we are prone to moods. Now let's imagine that uh, you are in a very disturbed emotional state. You have, say, lost a very dear friend. You come to the workplace, you are expected to, you would like to spend some time with this friend's family. Now when you come to the workplace, your boss tells you to stay on, tells you about a project you have to do, and asks you to do overtime. He says that you are not going home, you are not taking the weekend off until we complete this project. In the normal course of things, you are one of those very accommodating people who adjust their schedules to the work schedules of others and put the organization's needs before others, before your own needs. But in this case, you want to be so much with your friend's family. You are very disturbed, and the last thing on your mind is work. So do you take very kindly to the boss's diktat that nobody should leave the workplace? When he tells you, no weekends, no going home at 6 o'clock in the evening, staying late for work, you blow up. You literally blow up because you have so much pent-up emotion. Therefore, emotional state can also affect the communication process because it works as a very important filter in the communication process. How about attitudes? Do you think attitude can be a filter in the communication process? What do you mean by attitude? We're not talking about attitude as in the sense the present generation uses it. We talk, people today talk about, oh, I'm the guy with an attitude. Oh, he's one with an attitude. We're not talking about that. We're talking about attitudes in general. Many of us have very set attitudes towards situations, towards events, towards people. For instance, some of us feel that people from a certain part of the country are not competent. If this is the attitude we have, do you think we'd be willing to give a person who comes from that region a chance? Probably not. And if we don't do that, it's likely that we have lost a very good candidate. Similarly, we feel, we might have a very skeptical attitude towards certain subjects. We might not feel fully convinced about certain subject. We might not approve of them. And if someone were to suggest a particular way of doing things based on that subject, you might be very dismissive. You might be very negative towards the suggestion. So attitudes of any kind, they may be prejudices, they might be barriers, they might be stereotypes. It could be of any kind. Attitudes can also play as an important filter in the communication process. Finally, we come to communication skills. Some people are naturally more articulate. Here we're not necessarily talking about languages. We're not talking necessarily about language skills, though language skills do play a part in communication skills. But we are talking about certain people being more vocal. Certain people are able to vocalize their ideas or their feelings or their attitudes more unambiguously than others who are kind of incoherent, either because they don't know how to put their meaning into symbols or because they lack the language skills in one particular language. Whatever be the case, if your communication skills and those of your receiver are mismatched, it's possible that the message you have sent and the message that the receiver has received might be two different messages. And this is more likely to happen if the sender and the receiver do not speak the same languages. So let's sum up what we have done so far. We've been talking about the filters of communication, and we've been saying that the filters of communication make the process of encoding and decoding symbols so very complicated. For instance, now let's go back to our basic communication model. We had the sender and we also had the receiver. Yes. The sender is sending a message to the receiver using a symbol. Yes, symbol. But the sender's message, which he verbalizes through a symbol, is filtered through the sender's filters. When the receiver receives this message, the symbol, and decodes it, the receiver's filters come in the way of the decoding of this symbolic code. Suppose, and we talked about a whole lot of filters: knowledge, culture, status, emotional state, attitude, communication skills, and so on. So all these filters form a backdrop against which this particular symbol acquires meaning. When the receiver reconstructs the meaning of the symbol, his or her own filters serve as a reference point through which the symbol is interpreted. Let's go back to our example. when we looked at A giving meaning to nice, it had a particular meaning, and when B gave a meaning to nice, it had a different meaning because the filters of the sender and the receiver were very, very different. Now, what does one have to do to make sure that the meaning which has been sent is the same as the meaning received? It's far easier when the sender and the receiver or the various parties in the communication process have a similar background, a similar mental framework. In that case, because of the similarity of their filters, there is less likelihood of the mismatch of meaning. Because of the isomorphism of these filters, because of the correspondence of the filters of the sender or the receiver, there is a greater possibility of meaning corresponding. When this does not happen, which is very likely in the organizational setup, where we are not dealing with people we know, we are not aware of the background, their status, their knowledge, their culture, and so on. We cannot assume a commonality of knowledge. There is less likelihood of the filters matching, because in the workplace you are interacting with people from diverse cultural, linguistic, class backgrounds. So, if this is the case, if we begin with the assumption that the filters of the sender and the receiver are not similar, are not alike, the next best thing we can do is we try to find out the filters of the other party in the communication process. How? By asking questions, by clarification, by repeating the various, there are several ways in which we can try to gauge what is the background, what is the backdrop against which the receiver is going to reconstruct the meaning of the symbol which I as a sender have displayed. The more we find out what the receiver's filters are, the more chances there are of the correspondence of the meaning which we have communicated being identical with the meaning that the receiver has received. Now, we will play a game in which this game is called Walk a Mile in My Shoes. This game is to make you sensitive to others' filters. It is to make you see that if you are able to understand the filters of the other party, it's possible that the communication occurs, communication takes place in a more friendly and a more understanding environment. What did you find at the end of the game? The filters of the two parties were not identical, they were different. What was the difference between the filters of the sender and the receiver? Could you name some? Could you name some of the differences between the sender and the receiver? Yes, age, right? Age was one filter. Can we think of another one? Experience, yes, experience was another. One was modern and the other one traditional, yes, traditional, modern, yes, those could be differences. Bias, yes, bias, the attitudes that a person, status, very good, status, that I am older, therefore I know best, I am older, so I know best. Youth, yes, we are younger, what does he know about life? I know all about it. Attitude, one person is very tight-fisted, he feels he needs value for money, and the other person feels that life is meant to be experienced. Difference in attitudes, yes. One is culture. One comes from a more open culture, the other comes from a closed culture. Yes. So in this game, in this situation, we found how the filters, the various filters played a very important role in the miscommunication that occurred between the two parties. In the next round, when the two parties tried to understand each other's filters, you found that the communication process, the communication was far more smooth. It led to a kind of understanding. You might not agree, they might not have still agreed, but there was a kind of leeway given to the other party, a kind of openness to what the other party is trying to communicate, an attempt to understand the other person's filters. This is what we mean by filters. Now, from the filters, actually, we talk about filters and barriers. What do we mean by barriers? What do we mean by barriers? The difference, what is the difference between barriers and filters? As I explained earlier, filters are those elements which complicate, which interfere in the process of encoding and decoding messages. What are barriers? Barriers are those factors which impede the communication process. So sometimes, though they might overlap, they are not identical. Filters are not necessarily, filters are differences in the perception of the different parties in the communication process. They might not necessarily impede the communication process, whereas barriers are those aspects of communication which might impede the communication process. And it's possible, it's very likely that they might overlap with the filters, but they can also be different. Can you think of barriers to communication? Can you think of barriers, several barriers to communication? Emotions, yes, emotions. Let's think of emotions. Anger, yes, anger. What about love? Love itself can complicate, yes, it can be a barrier. Prejudice, stereotypes, yes, stereotypes. Noise, any kind of noise. Disturbance, yes. These are physical barriers, but they are also psychological barriers like polarizing. You say something is good, something is bad. That could be a psychological barrier. Ego, arrogance, self-centeredness, these are psychological barriers. You are so egoistic that you are not willing to receive other people's ideas. So shall we try to classify the barriers and the filters? I said that filters and barriers, though they might overlap, they are not really identical, because filters are those which complicate the process of encoding and decoding messages, whereas barriers are those which impede the communication process. There is a difference, and there is a possibility that both overlap. Shall we try to classify the three kinds of barriers? We can talk about three kinds of barriers. The first kind of barriers are barriers to reception. Suppose I spot you on a very busy road, a very crowded street. I spot you and I wave at you, but by the time I wave at you, but between you and me, you are on the other side of the road. There are a lot of vehicles passing by, a lot of people passing by, so you cannot really see the wave of my hand. That could be a barrier to reception. You haven't received my message at all. It could be that on a very noisy shop floor, you are shouting instructions to your workers and the workers cannot hear you. So that could be a barrier to reception. The noise on the factory, the noise on the shop floor prevents them from hearing your message. That's why, as you are aware, workers devise a very complicated non-verbal system of communication, which they have a code which they master, so that there can never be any room for mistake. You realize that a worker makes a mistake uh, in not following the instructions, it can cost him his life. Therefore, workers have usually devised a totally non-verbal visual system of communication through which they share and receive messages to be able to communicate over the noise and the cacophony of the workflow. These are the barriers to reception. The second category would be barriers to understanding. Barriers to understanding are different from the barriers to reception. You have received a message. Doesn't this happen to us in the classroom? We have received the message because in a classroom we are very attentive, we are listening very carefully. But is it possible that everybody in the classroom, in the lecture hall, has understood exactly what the lecturer is trying to say? Not always. You might have received the message, but you might not have understood the meaning of what has been told to you. This is the second category of barrier, the barrier to understanding. Now, this Mona heard her boss say that she must book a nice place, but she understood the meaning of nice differently from what the boss intended. So this was a barrier to understanding because of the differences in filters. This is where the filters and barriers come together. Because of the differences in the filters of Mona, the secretary, and her manager, she understood the word nice to mean something very different from what the manager intended it to be. And therefore, this was a barrier to understanding. The third barrier is far more complex, because here the receiver has received the message, understood the message, and yet is not willing to accept the message. What are the barriers to acceptance? What kind of messages are you unwilling to accept? Usually messages which are not very pleasant. You try to blot out messages, you try to screen out messages which threaten your self-esteem, which create a disturbance in your mind. So you might have, say, a rivalry with a colleague in the department. You might have heard the colleague very clearly. You might have even understood what the colleague is trying to convey. And yet, because of your strong feeling of hostility or rivalry towards your colleague, you are not willing to accept his idea, even though it might be a very brilliant idea. So barriers to acceptance are far more difficult to overcome than barriers to reception. What can you do to remove the barriers? Is there anything you can do to remove the barriers? What are the things you can do as a receiver to overcome barriers? As a receiver, as a sender, what can you do? Let's make a list. As a sender, what can you do to make sure that you overcome the barriers? The first stage, first of all, tell me, is communication the responsibility of the sender or of the receiver? Yes, it's a responsibility of both the sender and the receiver. So tell me, what can you as a sender do to make sure that there is no miscommunication? One, make the message clear, complete, and unambiguous. What does this mean? Suppose you tell your secretary, I'd like to meet you at 9:30 tomorrow. And the secretary nods and says, yes, I will be there at 9:30 tomorrow. Now, normally in the workplace, since we all work, the work hours are 9 to 5, the secretary logically and naturally assumes that you would like him to meet you at 9:30 in the morning. But this was a special meeting you had set up with the clients, and you want her to be present during that meeting and him to be present during this meeting, which is at 9:30 p.m. This is a dinner meeting. Because you did not say clearly, the secretary turned up at 9:30 in the morning and you weren't there. Why did this happen? This happened because your message was not complete. Had you said, please see me at 9:30 p.m. tomorrow, that might have left less room for ambiguity. Let your message be clear, complete, and unambiguous. What else can you do? Ask for feedback. Ask for feedback. We said that the communication process is incomplete, and one-way communication creates several communication problems. Therefore, it's also the sender's responsibility to make sure that the communication is not one way. Suppose you say, I would like to see you tomorrow at 9:30. Your secretary nods and says, yes sir, I'll be there at 9:30 tomorrow. Suppose the first time your message was not complete and you did not mention morning or evening. Suppose you were to ask for feedback. So I assume, I understand that you will be there tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. This is the time, by receiving the feedback, by getting the feedback, you have the opportunity to complete the message. You say, the secretary says at 9:30 tomorrow, and then you realize, oh, she might land up at 9:30 in the morning. You say 9:30 in the evening. Ask for feedback. What else can you do? Be redundant. What do you mean by being redundant? I would like you to be free. I would like to meet you at 9:30 tomorrow. You have told your secretary face to face. Before this, you had sent her an email saying that, dear so-and-so, or hi, would please keep yourself free at 9:30 p.m. in the evening. We have a dinner meeting with our clients from overseas. If it's possible that you send this email and your secretary hasn't yet opened his email, it's possible that your message hasn't been received. You make a call. When you call, the secretary is not on the seat. The second message has also not been received. The third time around, you call the secretary to your office and face to face, you convey this message. So what you have done is, you have sent this message in writing. Second time, or the phone, you have tried to contact the person. The third time around, you have said it face to face. Redundancy is essential, because if the first time the message has not been understood or has not been received, the second time probably it will be received, and if not, at least the third time. So be redundant. Reflect on the other's feelings. What does this mean? Suppose you say, hey, I would like you to be there at 9:30. Better keep yourself free at 9:30 in the evening tomorrow. And the poor secretary makes a face because he had an appointment with the dentist at 7:30, and there's no way he can be free by 9:30. So the secretary looks very reluctant, but at the same time he's thinking, now I'll have to cancel my appointment with the dentist and accompany my boss to this dinner meeting. He's too scared or too shy to tell you so. Had you been sensitive to the messages the secretary is sending out to you, perhaps you'd say, do you have any problems? And when you said this is the chance. I get the feeling, suppose you were to say, I get the feeling that you're not happy to be accompanying me. Is there a problem? This is the opportunity for the dentist, for the secretary to make the clarification. He would probably say, well, I had an engaged appointment with the dentist, but I could easily cancel that, sir. And if the situation is so grave that you cannot do without the secretary, probably it's unavoidable and you would probably try to get him to make another appointment. But if it's something which is avoidable, you could say, well, if that is more important, you need not come. So please reflect on the other's feelings. Speak the receiver's language. What do you mean by speaking the receiver's language? Let's say you're dealing with a person who is not very fluent in English and you deliver a particular instruction to the person in Queen's English. We were talking about filters like status. This person is too scared to say that he did not follow your accent and did not understand what you were saying. It's possible that because he did not understand what you were saying, he makes a mistake. Now, it's your responsibility as a sender to make sure that you speak, always give the benefit of the doubt, you speak the other person's language. Suppose the other person is more comfortable in the vernacular, and this happens very often in our workplace, that we are dealing with people who are not very fluent in English. Maybe you send your instructions, you convey your instructions in the vernacular language. If this has more possibility of being understood, speak the receiver's this should be language. Speak the receiver's language. What else? What else can you do? Make the message clear, complete and unambiguous. Ask for feedback. Be redundant. Reflect on the other's feelings. Speak the receiver's language and be yourself. That's the last point you can think. Don't try to, whenever you are communicating with another person, don't try to send contradictory messages. They seem to be contradictory. You're speaking the receiver's language and yet you are yourself. Be yourself. Have confidence in yourself, in what you're saying, and be yourself. Now let's look at the receiver. What can you as a receiver, what is the receiver's responsibility in the communication process? What can you as a receiver do to make sure that you have got the message correct, to remove the barriers to communication? The first thing the receiver can do is to practice active listening. Now, active listening means suspending judgment. We said that one of the most important barriers to acceptance was prejudice or bias. And this happens that when, even before we have heard out the other person, we are already composing the message mentally. We are already rejecting the message. So it's your responsibility as a receiver to suspend judgment, to practice active listening. Give feedback. If you haven't understood, if you want the communication process to be a two-way process, give feedback. If you had said, okay sir, you want me to be here at 9:30 in the morning tomorrow, your feedback might have made the manager aware of his mistake. He would say, no, of course not in the morning, in the evening. Give feedback to make communication a two-way process. Ask for clarification. If there is something you haven't understood, ask for clarification. How can you ask for clarification? By asking questions. You could ask closed questions or you could ask open questions. Understand the sender's feelings. We talked about the sender's responsibility to reflect on the receiver's feelings. This is equally true of the receiver. When a message is being conveyed to you, we began by saying that all the communication that is being expressed is not intentional. There are certain messages, certain meanings which are being conveyed in addition to or in spite of communication. We cannot not communicate. As a receiver, you have to read between the lines. You must see what is being said. Suppose the manager says, I want you, please be there at 9:30. I need you. I want you to be there. The manager is actually reposing his trust in you. If you are sensitive to meaning, to receiving messages, you say that this is a way of entrusting responsibility to you. Now, if you have heard this hidden meaning, it's possible that you might put all other commitments, all other appointments on the back burner and treat this as your top priority. Understand the sender's feelings. And what else? Try to understand, improve your communication skills. Improve your communication skills so that you can understand the other person's language. So with this we say that there are barriers of every kind, barriers to reception, barriers to understanding, and barriers to acceptance. Yet both the sender and the receiver in their own place can do things to remove these three kinds of barriers. Both as a sender and as a receiver, we can do things to remove the barriers at every stage of the communication process. Check at every stage, barrier to reception, check if the message has been received at all, check if it has been understood, and check if it has been accepted. I'll conclude by talking about three critical errors in communication. What are the critical errors in communication? The first error would be what I would call the assumption error. What do I mean by assumption error? Most of us take decisions. In fact, all of us are forced to take certain decisions on the basis of certain assumptions, certain things we take for granted. Now, if we have to work on a day-to-day basis, there are certain things we have to take for granted. For instance, we know that sun is going to rise in the east. We know that the workplace works from 9, the work hours are from 9 to 5, and the building in which we work is going to be there tomorrow morning. So certain basic assumptions we have to proceed with if we have to function. And yet, to make all your decisions on the basis of assumptions can be a very dangerous thing. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that it's very easy to confuse facts and assumptions. We are in the habit of assuming things on the basis of assuming things which we take as facts and making decisions on the basis of these assumptions. Let's take an example. There is an employee in your organization who stays and works up to 9 o'clock every evening, whereas most other employees leave at 6:30 to 7 at the most, at the latest. Now, since you keep late hours yourself and you like to work till all your employees have left, you have noticed this new young person staying late in office, poring over his files and poring over his computer till 9 o'clock. When the time for elevation for assessment comes up, you assume that this person has been working very hard. So in your report, you assume that since this person has been working till 9 o'clock, later than everybody else, he is a hard working person and must be a good person, must be a bright person. It's quite possible that this employee is staying later at work, one, because he has not understood certain things and he needs extra time to understand them. Two, he is doing something else in those 2 hours. Now, if you assume you have observed him working, which is a fact, he works later than everybody else. But to jump to the assumption that because he works later than everybody else, he is better or more hardworking than others is a mistake, because you are confusing fact, late working hours, with the assumption hardworking, which can lead you to make a very costly mistake. The next error is what is called failure to discriminate. What do we mean by failure to discriminate? What we mean is that most of us have a habit of generalizing. We say, we say people from the east are very lazy. The eastern part of India, people are very easygoing, they are lazy. We often have such prejudices. We stereotype people on the basis of their geographical location or on the basis of the profession. You say professors are all, they talk in the air. They're not on, their feet are not on the ground. So it may be a geographical stereotyping, it could be a professional stereotyping, it could be a ethnic stereotyping, it could be one kind of stereotyping or the other. So stereotyping, or it could be what is called polarization. We tend to say, oh, he's a very good worker and B is a very bad worker. Now we know life is not like that. People are not either good or bad. There is a gray area. Whereas we tend to polarize. We say somebody is good, somebody is bad. We can say somebody works 8 hours a day, somebody works 4 hours a day. But to make value judgments like somebody is good or placing them in two polar opposites is a mistake. Similarly, we have used something called frozen evaluation. Whenever we say he's a very hardworking person, what we mean is 4 years ago, he worked very hard. It's possible that due to various reasons, he's not working very hard now. And yet you have this frozen evaluation that because he was hardworking in the past, he's hardworking even now. So what you could do to do this, date it. Whenever you say, as far as my knowledge goes, till in the period he worked with me, he was a very good worker. Date your communication. The final one would be allness error. What do you mean by allness error? We tend to speak as if we know the whole of reality, but reality unfortunately is something which eludes us. We say, War and Peace is the best novel I have ever written. War and Peace is the best novel ever written. Now you are making a generalization, you are making an absolute statement, a sweeping statement. It's possible that in your opinion, War and Peace is the best novel ever written, but others might not agree with you. Now most of the statements we make are of this kind. What we must do is, we can say, in my opinion, War and Peace is the best novel ever written. These are the various ways: by dating, by indexing, by quoting, by putting your statements in quotation marks, like in my opinion, dating on this date, in this period, index, this, individualizing people. This is the way to avoid making critical errors in communication. So with this, we conclude the module on communication process and the barriers to communication. In this module, we tried to understand the meaning of the word communicate. We looked at one-way communication, the problems of one-way communication. We looked at some of the basic communication models, the infinity model of communication. We looked at the critical factors in communication. We examined the filters and barriers to communication. And finally, we concluded with how to remove the filters and barriers, and how to avoid making critical errors in communication. Having understood the communication process and the barriers to communication, we would now proceed to examine the process of encoding and decoding messages in the modules that follow. Thank you.